I'm so glad you're here, ladies and gentlemen. What a fantastic night to learn. And you know, I realize that I ask you to do a lot. And since I do the videos at home, I am asking you every night to make sure you get this done so that you can come to class and be successful. That's not an easy thing to do. I really, really, really want you to know how much I appreciate, your parents appreciate you putting forth the effort that it takes to be successful. And I know that that effort requires a positive attitude even during times when you don't feel like doing it or don't want to do it. You are doing a fantastic job, ladies and gentlemen, and I can tell you this, you won't recognize it right away, but you will see it in the future, and so will everyone else see it in you, the type of person that you are developing, that you are creating within yourself when you choose to do these to your best. I know it. So let's go on. Lesson 5.3, page 180, where we are going to write proportions. That's all we're going to do today. That's all we're going to do in the first video is write proportions. Our essential question, how can you write a proportion from a real life problem? So of course we're going to have that done in this first video. Ladies and gentlemen, you were asked to take notes on writing proportions from the top of page 180. We did make that page correction in class today before you went home. And in the book, when you read it, it talked about writing a proportion from a table. Now, I'm going to tell you, tables make it super simple to write proportions. And unfortunately, they're not going to use tables the majority of the time in real math. But the table is very helpful in us looking at and seeing and developing a way to write proportions. Now, the book calls two different things, two different ways to write proportions. They say columns and they say rows. I'm going to change that, so you might want to write this down as I'm writing, or pause when I'm done and then copy it down. I'm going to use rates, and then I'm going to use ratios. Let's start off with the first one, rates. I'm going to use rates. I'll be honest with you, the book calls rates columns. Anyway, I'm going to make my proportion template. You're going to get used to me saying that a lot because I know if I'm writing a proportion that I have two ratios that are equal, so I can just make this template. And when I use rates, I think to myself, I learned what a rate was. A rate is a ratio with different units. And if I use this column for trip 1 with my first ratio, I'm going to go trip 1 right here. My first ratio, miles to gallons, I have 104 miles to 4 gallons. Now that makes kind of sense. And then I come to my second column, trip 2, and I have 78 miles to 3 gallons. So I'm consistent in a couple different places, and that word consistent is really important. Trip 1 is my first ratio where I have miles over gallons. Trip 2 is my second ratio where I have miles over gallons. And notice, in the numerator, I have miles on both. Miles 104 on the top of the first one, 78 on the top of the second one. I have gallons in the denominator. So I'm consistent in my units in writing my proportion. Now notice, this 104 over 4, 78 over 3 kind of looks like the table. I could actually just take and stick an equal sign in here, put this bar here, and I have that very proportion written right there. Using columns, which I like to call rates because I'm going different units, miles to gallons. My second way that I talked to you and told you about was to use ratios. Ratios, as we know, compares with the same units. So when we compare with the same units, the book calls that rows. All right, so I'm going to make my proportion template, and I'm going to come over here to my rows, and if I go this way, on top, I'm putting miles. So I have 104 miles to 78 miles. Okay, so now I've got miles. That's going down with my first ratio. And then I have on the bottom gallons to gallons where it's 4 to 3. So these are my gallons. And recognize that trip 1 goes across as a row and trip 2 goes across as a row. And voila, I have another ratio, or excuse me, another proportion written. Now let's make sure that these really are in fact proportions. if I use my cross products, that's my go-to with my proportions. Cross products is my go-to. I multiply 104 times 3, I get 312. I multiply 78 times 4, I get 312. Those are equal. So yes, in fact, we do have a proportion. Now notice, even though I rewrote it differently. When I do my cross products, I'm still multiplying the same exact numbers, even though I wrote it a different way, using a different unit of consistency. So 104 times 3, yep, that's still 312, and 4 times 78 is still 312. And yes, these are still equal. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's only 2 ways. When you come to class tomorrow, someone please ask, Mr. Ross, you asked me on the video to show you the other 6. There's 6 more proportions I can write that would be correct with this table. Okay. But let's pay more attention to the consistency of how I wrote those proportions using the units of rates and ratios, because when we don't have a table, it will make more sense. However, we are going to practice writing from a table, so our first example today is going to be write a proportion using the table, and I'm going to do it both ways. The first one is going to be the rate way, and I'm going to write my proportion template, and I know if I just stick an equal sign in there, I can go W over 21, 8 over 12, and I'm done. It's really that straightforward. If I wanted to use my second way of ratios, and I write my proportion template, I would do W over 8 is equal to 21 over 12. I would be going this way, right, in the rows. And the first one, I went the other way, and I went down the columns. So rates and ratios, the 2 ways. Both of these answers are 100% correct, and yes, there are 6 other correct ones that you could write. So here's where it comes from a real-life problem, and here's where, when you don't have a table, it gets a little bit more challenging. The school requires 2 teachers for every 45 students. Write a proportion that gives the number T of teachers needed for 315 students. So we're going to get consistent here. We're going to look and say, hey, I know that I have to write a proportion. So I'm going to make my proportion template. And then I see where I'm marking my text that it's 2 teachers for every 45 students. That's a ratio. 2 teachers for 45. This is teachers and this is students. So I can say that's a ratio. Actually, that's a rate. Teachers to students. That's different units. So I can come over here and I can go 2 teachers for 45 students. And then I continue to mark my text. It says write a proportion that gives T number of teachers for 315 students. So that's 3 to 315. There's my second rate, T over 315. So this right here is one of 8 correct proportions I could write for this problem. But this one shows you in rates. As I have the ratios, which are rates are ratios, students and teachers to students as I wrote it. Here's the first quick write of the night. A paint color requires the ratio of green paint to yellow paint to be 4 to 9. A container of this paint has 36 pints of yellow paint. Write a proportion that gives the number G of pints of green paint in the container. So recognize you have a proportion to write. And so you can do a proportion template. Look at how it's worded. Look to see if you can find a ratio and then fill in the rest. We'll talk about it tomorrow in class. Take a quick break when you're done and come back for video number 2 of 3 that you must watch tonight.